Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Holbrooke? Yes, I knew him. The stage-setting dramatic words with which George Packer begins his 500-page important biography of the accomplished diplomat Richard Holbrooke. The book is called Our Man, Richard Holbrooke, and the End of the American Century. And it is a biography that reads like a novel, with the protagonist's flawed character sharply limbed as he deftly manages Viet Nam, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, Pakistan, certainly the most vexing foreign policy issues of the late 20th century. Holbrooke was ambitious, boorish, smart, and effective as he told truth to power and ruthlessly used carrots and sticks as an effective tool to achieve foreign policy objectives. But Holbrooke had a dark side. He was crudely narcissistic. When he went to a foreign country, the local ambassador cabled the State Department, "The ego has landed." He was treacherous. He betrayed his best friend. Convinced he knew best, he was abrasively obnoxious, pushing his agenda upon anyone who would listen. George Packer, best-selling author and winner of the National Book Award for The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America, is with us to reflect on Holbrooke's contribution. I'm delighted to welcome him to the program.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Well, delighted to have you. Now, George, you begin your book with the dramatic words, Holbrooke, yes, I knew him. It's sort of a riff on Hamlet in the Graveyard, Alas, Poor Yorick, the king's jester.
I knew him once, Horatio.
Knew him once, Horatio. Was Holbrooke something of a king's jester? Never the king, but always a very necessary player in the court?
He was somewhere above Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I'd say. He was close to the kings, always wanted to be the top advisor to the king, never got there because he himself kept becoming his own biggest obstacle. He made lots of enemies. He made Bill Clinton doubt his character as a Secretary of State, and Clinton went with Madeleine Albright in '96 instead of Holbrooke. But that first line that you quoted, for me, was the key to the book. I had his papers. They were given to me by his widow, Cati Martin, with no strings attached. But I didn't quite know what to do with them. I had letters, diaries, a huge archive. But what was the story I would tell and why? Because Holbrooke was not at the top. He was never Secretary of State. He was not world famous, and his name is already fading pretty quickly from even American memory. I thought what makes him fascinating, and he is fascinating, is the outsized character that you described that had equal portions of idealism and egotism, and the times in which he lived. He was, as Hillary Clinton said to me, the Zelig of American foreign policy. He was in the middle of action for 50 years, from Kennedy to Obama. I thought if I could tell that story in the form of a yarn, with a study of ambition and of this character at its heart, it would be a book worth writing and reading. Not for his CV or his list of accomplishments, but for his human character, which is riveting to me.
Well, Hillary Clinton said he was very much Zelig. He was talking to her about some point he wanted to make, and he followed her into the ladies' room.
He was relentless. I mean, that was one of the qualities that everyone talks about, how when he zeroed in on a goal, he was like a laser-guided missile. He would not let go until he had achieved what he wanted to. And it's kind of unusual in government. A lot of people occupy those chairs and end up just getting through and trying to preserve their power and not get on the wrong side of the king or of the press. Holbrooke judged himself by not just by how high he rose, which was important to him, but by what he did. And he was willing to take enormous risks all through his career in order to get big things done.
Well, you tell the story very much as though it were a Greek tragedy with or a Shakespearean tragedy, a man of action delayed by thought, or someone with a tragic flaw. And I know you quote Melville, Moby Dick, which...
Conrad. And Conrad, too.
Conrad, too. Both favorites of Holbrooke. But
definitely.
There was that line from Moby Dick, I sail on forbidden seas to land on barbarous coasts. Why is that emblematic of Holbrooke?
He loved that line because he had a sense of adventure and he had a sense of drama. I mean, he saw himself as the protagonist of his own story, and he was constantly finding witnesses, narrators, chroniclers to be there when he was negotiating the end of the war in Bosnia with Milosevic and the other Balkan leaders, or when he was heading off to Afghanistan to try to manipulate Hamid Karzai out of power. He always needed a witness, and he had me along for a little bit of it at the end of his life. I wrote a profile.
So you knew him?
I did know him, not like that narrator, and I'd like to talk about that. I knew him as a journalist. He plucked me, as he did other journalists, to sort of woo us and to court us and seduce, and I wrote a profile of him in the New Yorker in 2009, a year before he died. I didn't quite see what was really going on with him at the end of his life, and I think we should get to that. But basically, Barack Obama had no trust in him and no affection for him, and Holbrooke was losing altitude fast.
They had a bad first meeting, didn't they?
It was in Chicago just after the 2008 election. Obama summoned Holbrooke for a job interview at transition headquarters. Even though what he'd heard about Holbrooke wasn't particularly good, because Obama's key advisors, Anthony Lake and Susan Rice, were Holbrooke's greatest detractors.
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 Lake was really an enemy, wasn't he?
They began as best friends. They were
Viet Nam.
They were in the same Foreign Service class, 1962. They went to Vietnam together. They served in the early years of the Vietnam War. They were in Washington together. But at a key moment in their lives, a story that I'm not going to repeat here because I don't want to spoil it for viewers, but that is a key to the novel, to the book, which
it is a novel.
Made a little Freudian slip, since my impulse is always to novelize while staying true to the facts. Holbrooke betrayed Lake in a way that was unforgivable, although Lake tried to forgive. And over the years following, it became this acid that just corroded the foundation of what had been their friendship, until by the 90s they really were enemies. And it was important because they were working on Bosnia at the highest levels of the Clinton administration, and this bitterness was between them, and everyone around them felt it, and no one could understand it. And this is a lesson I learned from writing about Holbrooke, is how much of foreign policy and government work comes down to human relationships and human character. It's not abstractions, bloodless. There's a lot of blood on the floor in the making of foreign policy.
Well, Bosnia was really his signal diplomatic accomplishment, wasn't it?
Yes.
He tried to engineer a regime change in Afghanistan. It didn't work. It just made Karzai, the president, mad at him.
Yes.
And
Obama too.
And Obama too, and the mission ended really in failure.
Yes.
But you tell this story of a man who, very well intentioned, an internationalist, interested in human rights, which he pursued vigorously all over the world.
Refugees,
but at the same time,
yep.
Refugees, anti-AIDS, he was involved with the AIDS crisis in Africa. But at the same time, there were these glaring character flaws, not only his infidelities with women, but his mendacity. And you tell at least two instances of mendacity, one where he lied to Brzezinski about contacting a diplomat, and the other about an accident in Bosnia. Now, why don't you tell us about that?
So this was a dramatic moment at the beginning of Holbrooke's shuttle around the Balkan capitals to try to negotiate the end of this terrible war in Bosnia in 1995. He was trying to get into Sarajevo to see the Bosnian president, and he and his team were driving over a dangerous mountain road with Serb lines of sight toward the bottom. And at one point, the armored personnel carrier that had his colleagues in it slipped off the road and rolled 300 or 400 meters down the mountain, hit a tree, and burst into flames. And this is the story that begins Holbrooke's one and only book, an account of how he ended the war in Bosnia, to end a war. And in his account, he and General Wesley Clark, who was with him, are sort of the protagonists of this story.
The heroes.
They're the heroes. They don't they're not like dramatically action film heroes, but they're the ones who are taking action and trying to save people. And as I dug into this, it's an embellishment to the point of fabrication. And what is true is that the hero was an unknown colonel named Randall Banky, whom Holbrooke wrote out of his account, but not before implying that Banky had been a coward on the mountain and had run away from the accident. Instead, no, it was Banky who ran down the mountain, slid down at great risk to himself, and rescued several of the wounded Americans who managed to survive the accident. 3 Americans died along with the French driver. This to me was such a really shocking case of stealing the bravery of another person and leaving him hanging out to dry. And it kind of shows a ruthlessness about storytelling and about small people who Holbrooke didn't regard as important. He was willing to sacrifice them for his own glory. He used that story to get Bill Clinton to commit to intervention in Bosnia. The deaths of the Americans on that mountain was a kind of an origin myth for the American involvement in the war, which ended the war. So he had a goal that was in some ways noble, which was to get America involved to end the war in Bosnia. And the accident was the key precipitating event. But at what cost? The cost of a colonel that no one had heard of. And so I told the story in the book twice. Once through Holbrooke's great man of history account, which is what history remembers. And the second time at great length through all the reporting I did. I talked to every one of the survivors. I went to Mount Igman and walked all around the site and talked to Randall Banky, the colonel, and wrote it from his point of view, which is, I think, as close to the truth as we can come. And it just tells you something about how history gets written, unless by accident someone else comes along and figures it out.
There's another episode in the book which seems to evidence his character, and that's where there were limited seats on a bus to Auschwitz commemorating some anniversary
the 50th
of
the liberation, yes.
And there was a couple, they were survivors. They wanted to get on the bus.
They were part of the official delegation.
Yes.
They had come over from the U.S. at the invitation of the U.S. government to be on the American delegation. They were an elderly Jewish couple who had met at Auschwitz and married afterward. And Holbrooke heard about this ceremony because he was in Poland as the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and was negotiating NATO expansion at the time. And he just said, I've got to be in that delegation. Elie Wiesel is going to be there. And he managed to bounce this couple off the official bus from the U.S. consulate to Auschwitz. And when he was told this is for someone else and who they were, he just wouldn't give up his seat. He participated in the ceremony. The couple had to find their own way back to Auschwitz, weeping and begging the guards to let them into the camp. The ironies are just grotesque. And they made it to the ceremony just as it was ending. But here's the kicker. And this is something that I didn't have room really in the very brief account of that story to say. After the ceremony, they didn't know who this guy was who had bounced them. So Holbrooke introduced himself, and within a few minutes, they were best friends. He asked them all about their lives in the camp. He got them to show him around the camp and where they had been and what they had done, and showed so much interest and concern that they were hugging each other and weeping at the end. So that's the other side of Holbrooke. His ego was monstrous at times and capable of great cruelty, and his heart was also outsized and capable of great generosity. Without the heart, this story wouldn't be worth telling.
What can you tell us about his Jewish identity? I mean, he was the child of Holocaust refugees. Really.
Yeah. His mother was the daughter of a Jewish leather dealer, wealthy, who fled Hamburg in 1933 when Hitler came to power. And his father was the Jewish son of a nurse in Russia who fled Stalin. So they were both European refugees from the horrors of the 1930s. And they met in New York at International House at Columbia and married and had Richard Holbrooke almost immediately and erased the past.
The original name wasn't Holbrooke.
It was Goldbrake.
Goldbrake.
Abraham Goldbrake was his father's name. He became Dan Holbrooke, MD. They lived in Scarsdale. They had a post-war suburban American life with no trace of Jewishness or really of the past. They kind of buried it. It was painful. They wanted to become Americans. So they only spoke English around the boys. Holbrooke has a brother as well. And they kept the Jewishness kind of a secret. Holbrooke figured it out as a teenager, but never really at all talked about it or acknowledged it unless someone directly asked him. There's a story in the book where he runs into Jackie Mason, the comedian, in the kitchen of Holbrooke's best friend, Les Gelb. And Mason says to him, "Are you Jewish?" Holbrooke says, "Yes." And at that point, Gelb's wife, Judy, who's known Holbrooke for like 25 years, nearly drops her dinner plate. And Mason turns to her and says he's Jewish, but he spent his whole life denying it. So that
for many years, he professed to be a Quaker, didn't he?
He didn't profess so much as was raised going to Sunday school at the local Quaker church in Scarsdale because his parents wanted the boys to have some spiritual or cultural upbringing, but they were atheists. They were not really Quakers either. He was an American. That was his identity, and kind of a self-created one. He never talked about his parents. A lot of people never knew he had a brother. He kind of put the past in a vault and was always moving ahead and upward. That was the trajectory of his life.
But later on, when he became UN ambassador, or perhaps when he became ambassador to Germany before that, he kind of came out with being Jewish because that was helpful to him.
He became Jewish for about 4 or 5 years. He was Clinton's ambassador to Germany in 93, 94. And when he got that appointment, his friend Peter Tarnoff said, "Are you Jewish?" Holbrooke said, "Yes, why is that important?" And Tarnoff said, "You're going to Germany, it's important." And at that point, Holbrooke turned it to his advantage and spoke about it at his confirmation ceremony. And yet he was very wary of getting involved in Middle East politics. It was the only part of the world that he didn't try to grab with both hands. And that's because he saw it as politically so sensitive and dangerous that it might impede his lifelong effort to become Secretary of State.
Too easy to piss off Jewish groups.
You bet.
He had this interesting history of success as a diplomat, complicated by character flaws, and you see him as a metaphor for the American century, the 20th century. Of course, his professional life only spanned the second half of the 20th century. But why do you see him as so identified with what we were?
I see the American century as about 60 or 70 years. Beginning in 1941, which is when Henry Luce coined that phrase, the American century, Henry Luce of Time magazine. It was the year we entered World War II and became...
And the year Holbrooke was born.
And the year Holbrooke was born, conveniently enough. We became a global power through the war and the post-war. And even though his career he served under every Democratic president in the State Department, from Kennedy to Obama, with 3 wars at the heart of his career, Viet Nam, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. He represented that impulse to do everything, for America to be everywhere, for us to see ourselves as indispensable. And his vision was that if we did not get involved in other people's biggest problems early, they would eventually become our problems, and no one else could solve them. And although there's a lot of hubris in that, and a lot of, I think, self-deception, in Bosnia it was absolutely true. And you could point to other cases smaller than Bosnia that Holbrooke saw early on that the U.S. had to be involved. That doesn't mean we send the troops everywhere. For him, he was skeptical of the military. He learned early on in Vietnam that to militarize our foreign policy was to fail. He saw that within weeks of arriving at age 22 in the Mekong Delta, because we were making enemies out of the local peasantry using too much firepower. So it wasn't as if he was for bombing everyone into submission. He truly believed in diplomacy, but he believed in America as the key to the liberal order that was constructed in the ruins of World War II.
Now, you write in the book that you miss the second half of the 20th century. What do you miss about it?
Well, there's a lot not to miss. This book begins in Viet Nam and ends in Afghanistan. So it is not a rosy portrait of the American century. It's a portrait of failure more than of success. What I miss is the period before the period we're in now. I might not feel this way if something else were going on today, but I realized what this book was about on election night, 2016, because I suddenly understood that for better or worse, that period was over. The period of American leadership and of an American idea that whether we lived up to it or not, we held out as an example. Now what's our example? We're one more nasty, selfish power among others. We're modeling ourselves after Russia and maybe China. That's Trump's vision, that we need to be bigger and stronger than they are, but we're both fighting over spoils. And I feel that as a loss.
The American century was flawed, just as Richard Holbrooke was flawed. And in your book, you quote Graham Greene, The Quiet of American. I don't know whether that was a favorite of Holbrooke's or a favorite of yours.
He read it on his way to Vietnam in '63, and he said, not too bad, not too good, not me. He refused to see that might be him.
And you quote Greene's statement that he said, "I never knew a man who had better motives for all the trouble he caused." Was that Richard Holbrooke?
To some extent, it certainly was. Yeah, Holbrooke, Greene is talking about his protagonist, Alden Pyle, who is a wild-eyed, naive dreamer who thinks we're going to bring democracy at the barrel of a gun to Vietnam. Holbrooke was never simple-minded and naive like that. He understood the limits of American power. He did not understand the active harm, the fact that other people might see it as even a form of wickedness in the world. That he could not grasp. But he didn't see it as being simply, he was not a George W. Bush believer in democracy, will come as soon as we send in the troops. He certainly saw other countries in much more complex terms because he actually cared about other countries, spent a lot of time talking not just to leaders, but I think he probably never listened to anyone more closely than to a refugee, whether in Cambodia and the Thai-Cambodian border in 1979 or in Bosnia or Croatia in 1992 or in Pakistan in 2010. He had a passion for humanitarianism and thought, again, that we had the means, we should use it. We should not think that it's none of our business. So he listened. There are a lot of people he didn't listen to, colleagues, people he disregarded, people he thought were unimportant or unimpressive. But I think he really did listen to people who were suffering and who were oppressed.
Okay, so we have to wrap up, and I have a question for you, George Packer. You've portrayed a man who was self-centered, lying, abrasive, and very much disliked by his colleagues, and certainly a flawed personality, and it was treacherous. Henry Kissinger said he was viperous.
High praise from Henry Kissinger.
High praise from Henry Kissinger. And so what do you see as the importance of Richard Holbrooke?
Well, all those things you describe are true, but we should add he was loyal to his friends. He was...
Not to his wives.
Maybe to his third wife in his way, although there were betrayals on both sides. But yeah, he was a lousy father. He had tremendous capacity to ignore what he didn't want to see, and especially in himself. He did not know himself. That was his tragic flaw, if you want to talk about a Shakespearean flaw. But his staff worshipped him. the young people who work for him. He became a mentor to a dozen or 24 young State Department officers and was tough on them, but generous to them. So he had this real conflicting mix of qualities. I think I was willing to spend 4 or 5 years and 500 pages with him because, first of all, I love history and he's in the thick of it all the time. And second, because I'm not looking for either an impressive CV or a sterling character. I'm looking for someone who's interesting and who you can never quite predict what he might do next, and who, where other people might fear to tread, he barges in.
Okay,
and that, to me, that's worth a book.
Someone who's interesting and worth a book, well worth the read. George Packer, our man, Richard Holbrooke, and the end of the 20th century. Thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous.
Thank you, Jim.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.